The year was 1877. A Danish survey team trudged across the slow-heaving back of southern Greenland, wrapped in furs and frost. The sky above them was a washed-out silver, the kind of daylight that never quite warms the earth. Their mission was scientific, to chart recent glacial shifts for Copenhagen's Royal Geographical Society. Nothing more. But deep in a sunken ravine where the summer melt had begun to gnaw at the ice pack, something strange appeared. A bundle of stiff, blackened material, half embedded in permafrost. One of the younger assistants, a half Icelandic student named Mikkel Eriksson, noticed the sharp edge of a bone needle still tucked into its seam. Curious, they pried it free. What emerged stunned them all. A scroll stitched from animal hide, bound with sinew and brittle with age, unfolded in crackling protest. The surface, darkened by centuries of frost and mold, was covered in faint lines and angular markings. Mikkel leaned in, breath steaming. He knew the shapes immediately. They were not scribbles or scratches. They were runes. Old Norse. Ancient. The object was packed away and carried home, briefly examined in the archives of Copenhagen, and then shelved. The drawings were unclear, the shapes too rough to resemble anything definite. Some dismissed it as a hoax, others a ritual curiosity. A pagan relic, one archivist wrote in his log, of no cartographic value, and so it vanished into dust. Until 2019. That year, the scroll was rediscovered during a digitization project at the National Museum. For the first time, it was scanned with multispectral imaging, a technique that could peel away the layers of age, revealing what centuries had hidden. What the researchers saw beneath the stains and tears would upend their understanding of Viking history. A coastline irregular, jagged, wild, took shape under the spectral light. Fjords, promontories, and river mouths were marked with tiny symbols, each accompanied by angular runes denoting hazards, distances, and resources. Across the upper quadrant ran a single word: Vinland. It was not a ritual object. It was not decorative. It was a map. The coastline bore an uncanny resemblance to modern satellite images of Newfoundland's northern shore. The proportions were imperfect, but the angles, the major landforms, the placements of capes and inlets, were too consistent to be guessed. Other rune clusters named Markland, Helluland, and a mysterious site labeled Leifsfjordur, names familiar only from Norse sagas, long considered semi-mythical. Here they were, rendered not in poetry, but in practical marks. Even more startling were the tools diagrammed in the margins. A stylized solar disk, perhaps a reference to the fabled Viking sunstone in curved lines that mirrored the paths of prevailing ocean currents. Directions weren't listed by compass, but by rowing time. Landmarks were shown not to scale, but in relational logic, the way an experienced sailor would remember the world. The hide itself was carbon dated to somewhere between 1000 and 1150 CE. That placed it firmly within the Viking Age, and centuries before the European discovery of the New World. For scholars of Viking navigation, this revelation cracked open a door that had long been shut. For decades, academics had insisted the Norse relied purely on oral tradition, intuition, and the stars. They did not need maps, we were told. And yet, here was one, fragile, hand-drawn, weather-worn, but real. And if one existed, how many others had vanished? How many lay rotting in barrows under bog and stone, consumed in Christian bonfires, or forgotten in monasteries that dared not preserve the work of pagan cartographers? It was never just about paper. The Norse never separated map from myth, land from story. Geography was sacred. A coastline wasn't merely a shape. It was a memory, a lineage, a ghost. To record it was to make a pact with it. This explains why their maps do not resemble ours. Some were carved into whalebone, etched into the handles of oars, or passed on in sung verse. Others were ritual drawn not for many eyes, but for the chosen few: navigators, explorers, rune, priests who read the sea as scripture. And this is perhaps why they vanished. Because when Viking society began to fall to the cross and the crown, when skalds were silenced and fire replaced frost in their sacred woods, much of that knowledge was deemed heresy. It was not preserved. It was punished. The Christian scribes who rewrote Norse history preserved the battles, the martyrs, the kings, but they had no place for the skin-bound charts of Odin's sea kings. The scroll found in the Greenland ice was not just a curiosity, it was a survivor, a whisper from a forgotten mind who once stood at the prow of a longship and looked west not blindly, but with knowledge, with memory, with intent. The world may remember Columbus, but the ice remembers Sigurd. And now, for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, his map has returned. Part 2. Beyond the sagas. Were Viking maps real? For centuries, the image of the Viking navigator has been one of raw instinct. A man wrapped in fur and salt, steering by the stars, guided more by gut than geometry. He is fearless, yes, but also blind, hurling himself across the ocean with nothing but oars, ravens, and runes carved into his sword hilt. This is the story we inherited, but it may be a lie. Because in the heart of Viking culture, beneath the firelight of longhouses, between verses of sagas, and along the hulls of their swift black ships, there are clues. Clues that suggest the Norse not only knew more than we imagined, but recorded it. Not in ink and parchment, but in forms modern eyes have failed to recognize as maps. Not long ago, historians dismissed the idea outright. Viking cartography? Impossible. These were oral people. They argued their knowledge passed through story, not sketch. The sagas, rich in memory and metaphor, were considered the sole record of their journeys. But that perspective is beginning to fracture. Let us begin with a simple question. If the Norse had no maps, how did they find their way so precisely again and again to lands as distant as Greenland, Ireland, and even North America? The open sea is no forgiving teacher. The North Atlantic swallows the unprepared. And yet, Viking longships struck out with terrifying accuracy, to do so without some externalized system, a visual memory aid. A spatial framework defies logic, and, as new evidence suggests, defies the truth. In recent decades, archaeologists have recovered a growing number of strange, overlooked objects from Viking Age sites. Whale bones carved with linear patterns, wooden tablets etched with symbols, rune stones standing in lines that mimic coastlines. Initially cataloged as ritual items or toys, some of these artifacts are now being reconsidered. One such object, recovered from a burial mound in Vestfold, Norway, was long thought to be a broken sled runner. Upon re-examination with advanced imaging, it revealed faded etchings on its underside, a sequence of notched lines resembling coastal profiles, punctuated by repeating sigils. Similar finds have surfaced in Greenland and the Faroe Islands. Were these coastal markers, memory aids, proto-maps? Even more telling are the fragments of saga literature that describe in coded language the preservation of geographical memory. In the saga of the Greenlanders, we find the passage: Leif laid stones upon the shore, as his father had taught him, and marked the time of the sun with 3 steps on the tide. So it was said, where the sun makes a path of fire on the sea, there lies the land of wine. To a modern reader, this is poetry, but to a navigator, it is instruction. These were memory maps, oral cartography, encoded in verse. Skalds, the Norse poets, were not mere entertainers. They were walking archives, responsible for encoding and transmitting information too sacred or secret to be written. The directional cues, landmarks, and sea rhythms of their journeys were woven into tales of gods and heroes. But beneath the myth was method. Modern linguists have begun to identify navigational structures hidden within these texts. Repeating cadence patterns known as kenningar sometimes serve not only metaphorical function, but geographical structure. Think of it as a rhythm of remembering, each phrase unlocking a stretch of coastline, a sequence of stars, a series of currents. To the uninitiated, it was story. To the trained, it was a chart. And then there are the sunstones. Long considered a legend, these translucent crystals known as Iceland spar have been proven to polarize light, allowing sailors to locate the position of the hidden sun on overcast days. One such stone was recovered from the wreck of an Elizabethan warship off the coast of Alderney, believed to be a Viking relic reused centuries later. This tool, once mythologized, is now understood as sophisticated navigational equipment. If the Norse used such tools, would they not also record their use? Not in ink, perhaps, but in carvings, chants, or coded scripts. This brings us to a deeper truth. Viking maps did exist, but they were not meant to look like ours. To map the Norse world was to describe a lived experience. It was not a grid, but a memory, a song of shorelines, a spiral of wind and whale road. It was embedded in tools, stories, and rituals. Where we expect scale and orientation, they employed relationship and rhythm. Imagine a carved staff passed from helmsman to helmsman, each notch a harbor, each symbol a danger, each twist of the wood a current remembered. Imagine a longhouse wall painted not with land masses, but with constellations and seabird migrations. Imagine a chieftain's sword hilt inlaid with the sequence of isles from Bergen to the Hebrides. Not decorative, but directional. To us, these are art. To them, they were charts. And if these maps were real and all evidence now leans toward that possibility, the next question is more unsettling. Where did they go? Some may have rotted in bogs, buried with their bearers. Others may have been destroyed by Christian missionaries eager to erase the pagan sciences. Still others may sit, unidentified, in dusty museum drawers dismissed as abstract, decorative, or ceremonial. A 13th century monk in Iceland once wrote of forbidden scrolls, bound in hide, that mark the western seas beyond the God-fearing world. He called them instruments of pride, burned at the order of a bishop. One wonders what knowledge curled to ash in that fire. The Norse knew more than they told, and they remembered more than we have yet found. The sagas whisper, the stones remember, and the sea, vast and cold, still holds their secret paths. If we want to find the Viking maps, we must first relearn how to see. Part 3. Sigurd's Journey. He was called Sigurd the Whale-Eyed, though no one knew exactly why. Some said it was the way he squinted into the salt wind, scanning the horizon like a gull. Others whispered it was because he could see the shape of a coastline days before the prow of his ship touched it, as though the world beyond the waves unfolded in his mind before it ever did beneath his keel. What is certain is this: Sigurd knew how to find land where others found only mist, and in the year 998, he was tasked with something few in his clan had attempted to record what he saw. Sigurd was a Leithsogumadr, a pathfinder, chosen not by bloodline, but by memory. He had sailed from Trondheim to the Hebrides, crossed the gray-green teeth of the North Atlantic to the edge of Greenland, and returned with fewer men than he left, with but far more stories. His knowledge was weighty, wordless, but now his Jarl wanted it made permanent. Jarl Erik, chieftain of the western fjords, had ambitions beyond raids and cattle dues. He had heard of Vinland. His uncle, it was said, had glimpsed its forests in a dream and smelled its grapes on the wind. Erik wanted more than sagas. He wanted routes the kind that could be followed with ships, not songs. So Sigurd was summoned to the Jarl's hall, where firelight flickered on carved roof beams, and the skins of bears hung beside shields. A scroll of walrus hide was laid before him, still supple with whale oil. A bone stylus was pressed into his hand. "Draw what you remember," the Jarl said, "not in the tongue of the Scalds, in the tongue of the sea." Sigurd did not answer with words. He nodded once, sat before the stretched skin, and stared into it as though it were a pool of water waiting for reflection. He began with the known, the coast of Iceland, notched like a broken sword, the deep fjords of the east, where ice floated like shattered glass. He marked the nesting cliffs of seabirds, the warm currents that curled from the south. Runes were not his only tool. He used lines, dots, spirals, each one meaning something specific. Reefs, coves, places where whales breached, places where ships could anchor with little fear of storm. He carved rivers where none had been named, placing them beside silhouettes of trees. He sketched the drift patterns of kelp rafts, the hunger paths of seabirds that always flew toward land at dusk. Over weeks, the map grew not in scale, but in memory. It looked nothing like the charts of later centuries. It was not geometric. It was relational. Each place existed only in its connection to the others. 2 days west of the whale's tooth, under a pale sky, where the wind smells of birch. To modern eyes, it would be madness. To Sigurd, it was a song frozen in bone. He kept beside him his sunstein, a shard of Iceland spar. With it, he would test the direction of sunlight, even on cloudy days. He'd teach his apprentices to look for the glow band in the sky and note the hour by the tilt of their shadows. He carved those same principles into his map. A spiral etched beside a runic phrase meant, "Here the sun strikes water from the east at high summer sail, before midday or risk fog." He also recorded stories not in prose, but in rune codes only trained eyes would understand. Near one jagged coastline he inscribed, "The crying tree sings here." It was a marker for the cliffs of Newfoundland, where sharp winds cut through stunted pines that moaned like voices in storm. Some parts he refused to mark, places he believed sacred, or cursed, or both. There were lands Sigurd would not commit to hide, not out of ignorance but reverence. A sailor's map was a trust. Too much knowledge, given too freely, could doom the next man's voyage. And so he encoded. His apprentices watched. Young men from the Jarl's house, future helmsmen and traders, gathered by firelight and copied his symbols onto driftwood slats. Each man was assigned a portion to memorize, as if learning verses. Sigurd did not simply give them a map. He taught them to become the map. "We do not sail by sight," he told them. "We sail by what we remember when the sea wants us to forget." By the time Sigurd finished, the hide was crowded with marks, a tangle of signs and gestures that only he could fully read. He presented it to the Jarl in silence. The old man studied it for a long while, brow furrowed. "Is it true?" he asked. Sigurd's eyes, pale and unblinking, gave no answer but the faintest narrowing. "It is enough," the Jarl muttered. "We will sail." And so the map became more than memory. It became a guide. That summer, 3 ships followed its arc across the Atlantic. They made landfall in forested coasts where wild grapes grew and the nights pulsed with insects instead of snow. They had found Vinland, but Sigurd never went back. Some say he retired inland, vanishing into the pine woods of western Norway. Others claim he sailed again west of Vinland, into waters no saga ever named. One tale insists he buried his final map under a stone cairn and placed a raven's feather atop it, warning others not to dig. What is known is this: none of his students could fully replicate what he made. They remembered fragments, they copied patterns, but something was always missing: a detail, a rhythm, a curve of wind only Sigurd had seen. And so the knowledge faded, slowly, quietly. until the world forgot that men like Sigurd ever drew the sea at all. Part 4. The Western Ocean. It was called the Whale Road, and it shimmered like polished iron beneath the sky. To the Norse, the Western Ocean was not a barrier, it was a bridge, a vast heaving corridor that led not to nowhere, but to somewhere unknown, rich, and alive. They did not fear it. They courted it. Like Odin, who gave his eye for wisdom, they were willing to lose much to gain what lay beyond the horizon. And beyond it lay Vinland. For centuries, the story of Viking landings in North America hovered at the edge of credibility, whispered in the sagas, ridiculed in classrooms, dismissed by historians. But the ground tells no lies. And in 1960, the earth itself spoke. At the northern tip of Newfoundland, in a place now called Lanso Meadows, archaeologists Helga and Anstein Ingstad unearthed what the sagas had always hinted at: the remains of an 11th century Norse settlement. Turf walls, iron nails, boat repair tools, a ringed spindle once used by a woman from Greenland. Suddenly, Vinland was not a myth. It was a place. But the site raised more questions than it answered. It was too small to be a colony, too short-lived to be a capital, and too remote to be the heart of an empire. So what was it? The answer may lie in the maps that have vanished, and in the roots still whispered by the sea. Lanso Meadows is not an origin point. It is an echo. Consider this. For Norse sailors of the 11th century to reach that coast, they had to cross over 20 kilometers of open water from Greenland, often in vessels no longer than a city bus. They had to know where to aim, when to leave, what currents to follow, how to recognize land from mist, and they had to do it more than once. This was not accident, this was method. It's no longer a question of whether the Norse reached North America. The question is how far they went, and how well they remembered it. In recent years, dozens of strange findings have emerged along the coasts of eastern Canada and New England. At Point Rosie, Newfoundland, satellite imagery revealed what may be another Norse-style sod structure buried just beneath the soil. In the Gulf of St. Lawrence, ancient Norse-style ironwork has been found far from Lanso Meadows, in areas long thought untouched by European hands before Columbus. Some of these discoveries are contested, but together they paint a picture. The Norse were not visitors, they were voyagers. They moved, they mapped, they returned, or at least they tried. The sagas speak of places beyond Vinland: Markland, the forest land, likely Labrador, Helluland, the land of flat stones, perhaps Baffin Island. These were not dreamscapes. They were descriptions. Helluland was cold and barren. Markland teemed with timber. Vinland, with its mild weather and wild grapes, was a jewel the furthest reach of Norse ambition in the West. But none of these places appear on surviving maps from the medieval period. Not a single Norse chart includes the coastlines described so vividly in the sagas. Why? Perhaps because their maps didn't survive, or perhaps because they weren't meant to. The Norse understood something that later empires forgot. Knowledge could be power, but power could be peril. To write a map was to risk losing it. To share it was to risk betrayal. And so the knowledge was guarded, passed in whispers, embedded in story, etched into bone or wood, then destroyed or buried. But some echoes remain. In the 14th century Icelandic manuscript Hauksbók, an annotated version of the Vinland sagas appears, and included among the notes are distances, days sailed west from Greenland, descriptions of winds, seabirds, and currents. It may not look like a map, but it functions as one. Even more curious is the discovery of North American butternuts at the Lanso Meadows site, a tree that doesn't grow that far north. This suggests the Norse traveled south by river or coast, perhaps hundreds of miles, and brought back materials. They didn't just land, they explored. They may have reached the Bay of Fundy, the Hudson River, even the interior river valleys of what would become New England. And yet, we have no names for these places, no maps, only hints. One of the strangest hints comes not from Scandinavia but from Venice. A 15th century Venetian chart known as the Zeno map depicts a large island west of Iceland labeled Frisland, and a coastline even further west, labeled with strange Norse-sounding names. The map was dismissed for centuries as a Renaissance hoax, until one scholar noticed the sailing distances were roughly accurate to Greenland and Newfoundland. Could this be a distorted echo of a Norse map, copied secondhand through traders who never knew what they had? Perhaps, or perhaps it was something more. If Viking maps of the West existed, why were they forgotten? The simplest answer is that they weren't, at least, not entirely. They were hidden, lost, or destroyed. The voyages west became more dangerous as climate cooled during the Little Ice Age. The Greenland colonies grew isolated. Trade routes shifted, and in time, the last map to Vinland may have vanished with the last ship that remembered how to find it. But they were real, because no one finds a continent by accident. And the Norse did not believe in accidents. They believed in patterns, in memory, in markings that outlasted speech. They mapped the world with hands, wind, and whalebone, and for a time, they reached further west than any European before them. Then the sea took it back. Until now. Part 5. Sacred Maps and Forbidden Knowledge. In Viking society, not all knowledge was meant to be shared. Some was sung at feasts and carved in stone. Some was passed between father and son beneath the thatched beams of a longhouse. But other knowledge, the kind that touched the edges of the world, the kind that risked angering the gods or unbalancing fate, was guarded, hidden, and in some cases, erased. This was the fate of certain maps. To the Norse, geography was not just physical, it was spiritual. A coastline was not merely a jagged line where land met water, it was a threshold, a liminal place. And to map such thresholds was to name the bones of the world. That act carried power, and power demanded responsibility. So the most sacred maps were not scrolls but talismans. They were etched into walrus tusks, and then buried. They were sewn into cloaks, with threads of dyed horsehair. They were sung only in the darkness of the second sleep, when the hearth burned low, and the soul drifted closer to the gods. These maps didn't mark latitudes, they marked passages, between known and unknown, between the mortal and the divine. They were not for trade. They were not for sale. They were for those who had earned them. Among Norse seafarers, to possess a map of distant lands was to possess a dangerous secret. It meant you had walked the edge of the world and returned. It meant you had spoken to spirits in the wind and remembered what they said. And it meant you had seen something that the jarls and the priests and the poets could not afford to explain. There are traces of this fear in the saga's fragments that hint at more than mere superstition. In the saga of Eric the Red, a mariner returns from the western sea with madness in his eyes and speaks of trees that weep salt and birds that speak in the voices of men. He burns his cloak, whispers to no one, and takes to the hills. Another tale, from a now lost manuscript referenced in a 17th century antiquarian's notes, describes a group of explorers who return from Vinland and are forbidden to speak of what they saw. One carves runes into a stone near Thingvellir that reads, "I have seen the sky fall into the sea. I will not speak again." These stories are more than metaphor. They are warnings. Among the Norse, there were two kinds of maps. The first were practical, sailing directions, tide markers, and currents shared between crews, chanted by Leithsögumaður before a voyage. These were communal, though still respected. The second were sacred, maps of distant shores where spirits walked and omens gathered. These were never shown to outsiders. They were not drawn in the open or copied freely. Some were etched on items that only the navigator carried: a bone rod, a knife handle, a decorated shield boss. Some were burned after use. This secrecy was not born of selfishness. It was born of fear, because to chart the unknown was to bind it, and to bind it was to bring it closer. There is a tale seldom spoken aloud of a cursed scroll brought back from a western voyage by a man named Bjorn of the Fjord-Eyes. The scroll was made of stitched sealskin, and the runes upon it were said to dance when held to fire. It showed a land where rivers ran backward, and fish climbed trees. Bjorn showed the scroll to a priest in Bergen. Within a week, 3 of his crew were dead. The 4th disappeared. Bjorn himself was last seen sailing north alone, muttering about finding the mouth of the world serpent. The scroll, if it existed, was never found. In the 11th century, as Christianity spread across Scandinavia, the old ways came under siege. Sacred groves were felled, temples were burned, runes were banned or distorted into Christian carvings, and maps, the old maps, suffered the same fate. A church chronicle from 1054 describes heretical seafarers who used demonic instruments to find forbidden lands. It reports the confiscation and burning of one hide chart of the pagan seas. Another entry from the monastic library of Skalholt mentions scrolls of the western void, marked in the tongues of ash and bone, which were sealed away. Some monks saw these artifacts as dangerous, others as temptations. Either way, they were removed. This was not just a suppression of knowledge, it was a rupture. With the rise of Christian orthodoxy came a shift in worldview. The world became a garden, bounded and ordered, not a wilderness of thresholds and shadows. There was no place for a map that led beyond Eden, no room for a chart that curved into myth. The sacred maps were no longer sacred. They were heresy. What few survived did so in silence, hidden in burial mounds, etched into lintels of forgotten boathouses, encoded in sagas, their true meaning known only to those who remembered the old signs. A few may still linger in archives, misidentified as decorative patterns or talismanic symbols. One bone staff in the Bergen Museum, thought to be a scribe's pointer, bears runes so faint they can only be seen under ultraviolet light, and the line they form matches the coastline of Nova Scotia. Coincidence? Perhaps. But perhaps not. Perhaps the sacred maps were never lost, only waiting. There's a saying among the Sami, the ancient people of the northern lands: what is hidden is not gone. The Norse knew this too. The sacred maps were never for everyone. They were for those willing to see the world as it is: wild, curved, unfinished. For those who understood that to trace a path across the sea was to take part in a kind of magic, and that magic, once cast, does not die. It drifts. It waits. It returns. Part 6. The Monastic Thieves. The long winter was ending when Brother Runulfur opened the sea chest. It had arrived from Greenland under secrecy, carried by 2 silent men, whose cloaks still stank of salt and tallow. They said nothing, offered no names, and handed the carved box over with a warning: do not show this to the bishop. He fears such things. Runulfur waited until nightfall. When the scriptorium had gone still, he placed the chest upon his writing desk in the rear alcove of the abbey at Ingerar, where no one but the ravens watched from the high beams. The lock was crude, wrapped in whale sinew and sealed with pitch. Inside he found a scroll, not of parchment, not of vellum, but of stitched hide, covered in runes. At first glance it was a thing of madness. A map, perhaps, but nothing like the orderly Roman geometries of the monastery's own atlases. No compass rose, no grid, no borders. just a spiral of symbols, fjords, stars, trees, currents, all connected by curling lines that flowed like a serpent across the skin. In the margins, phrases written in Old Norse, where the birds do not sleep, land where no frost bites. Here lies the island that bleeds. Runolfr recognized it instantly. This was not pagan superstition. This was navigation, a sailor's map, and not of Europe. This was a map of the Western Void. Such stories, whispered and half erased, appear in monastery records across Iceland, Orkney, even northern England. Mentions of pagan scrolls, hide maps of the forbidden West, and charts drawn in the tongue of the old gods. They were not catalogued as artifacts of geography. They were recorded as dangers, temptations, tools of the devil. In a codex from Skalholt Cathedral dated to 1128, a frightened monk recounts the burning of a great seal, hide covered in marks that resemble the runes of sorcery. The hide had been brought by a sailor from Greenland, who claimed it showed a path beyond Helluland, beyond the screaming forests. The bishop ordered it destroyed without translation, but not all were so obedient. Some monks were not just scribes, they were collectors, and they recognized what they held. During the Christianization of the Norse world in the 10th to 12th centuries, monasteries became both centers of learning and gatekeepers of memory. They transcribed the sagas, preserving much, but subtly reshaping what they recorded. Pagan cosmology was trimmed, dangerous symbols removed, and when older documents arrived, documents with no saints, no Christ, no moral, they were either altered or buried. Yet there were those who copied them in secret. Marginalia and several Icelandic religious texts suggest monastic scribes occasionally replicated Viking maps under code. A series of fish-like sigils appear in unrelated margins, always in the same sequence: east pointing, then north pointing, then curved. Scholars once believed them to be decorative, but when placed against the western coast of Greenland, they align with ancient sailing routes to Baffin Island and beyond. Even more striking is a folio in the Lambeth Palace Library, long ignored, which shows a stylized island beyond the ice, labeled only Terra Ultima. No one knows who drew it. No known medieval map includes it, but its contours match Newfoundland. These documents were not stolen in the way of thieves, at least, not at first. They were seized, copied, interpreted, but over time, the tone changed. As Christian power deepened its grip, knowledge outside of sanctioned doctrine was not merely edited, it was erased. Maps that showed other worlds, heresy, runes that named unfamiliar stars, sorcery, charts that proved the Norse had reached lands untouched by Rome, uncomfortable truths that risked unraveling the very foundation of ecclesiastical geography, that the world was known, ordered, and ruled by Christendom alone. And so the scrolls disappeared. But not all of them. In a forgotten crypt beneath York Minster, archivists in the 19th century discovered a wooden chest sealed since the Norman invasion. Among its contents, Norse coins, a raven, engraved brooch, and a fragment of what appeared to be a carved driftwood rod. The notches on the rod were interpreted as a tally stick. But in 2022, researchers ran the fragment through a laser scan, and the notches, when converted to a linear sequence and mapped against known currents, corresponded to sailing distances between Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland. A tally stick? No. It was a navigational tool, a map, hidden in the crypt of a Christian church. Forgotten, unread. What the monks feared was not the map itself. It was what the map implied, that there were lands the church had no claim to, that pagans had touched them first. That sacred knowledge existed outside their walls. Some may have preserved these artifacts in secret, men like Runolfr, who never confessed what he saw, but whose writings grew increasingly symbolic in his final years. His last manuscript, a devotional poem, ends with a single line. The land beyond the edge sings still. To this day, no one knows what he meant. The theft of the maps was not done with blades. It was done with silence. Scrolls burned, bones buried, stories rewritten, but they have not all vanished. For even stolen knowledge leaves fingerprints in the margins of forgotten books, in the soot-stained corners of abbey basements, in the symbols carved by trembling hands on scraps of driftwood that somehow, miraculously, survive. The monastic thieves did not destroy the truth. They only delayed it. And now the tide is turning again. Part 7. Rediscovered artifacts. The ground never forgets. Long after fire has erased scrolls and silence has buried memory, the soil keeps its secrets. And in recent years, as archaeologists, historians, and scientists have learned to ask the right questions and use the right tools, the earth has begun to whisper again. It began with the bones. In 2008, a burial site near Hafnir, Iceland, revealed the remains of a seafarer interred with what was first thought to be a decorative staff, made of driftwood, carved with spiraling grooves, and capped with a bronze disc. The object had no parallel in known Viking artifacts. Initially dismissed as ceremonial, the staff was later scanned with hyperspectral imaging. Beneath a layer of soot and oxidation, faint runes emerged, not names, but directional indicators, currents, winds, landmarks, a code, readable only by those who had learned the system. It was not a scepter, it was a map. This discovery opened the floodgates. In museums and storerooms across Scandinavia, researchers began re-examining old artifacts using new technologies, UV light, LIDAR, 3D scanning tools that could penetrate the veil of centuries. What had once looked like weathering or wear began to show intentionality, patterns, purpose. At the National Museum of Denmark, a flat slate stone from a Greenland dig site catalogued as a whetstone was found to have a detailed grid etched on one side. It was no whetstone. It was a primitive navigational chart marking latitudinal sun angles with horizon line notations. Another fragment, a whale rib from the Faroe Islands, bore tiny notches arranged in clusters. For years it sat in a drawer labeled Ritual Tally. But in 2021, a doctoral student at the University of Oslo matched those notches to lunar tide cycles along the Labrador coast. It wasn't ritual. It was a tide calendar, part of a sailor's internal almanac. One by one, these artifacts are being reinterpreted, reclassified. What had been dismissed as art or superstition or accident is beginning to look like a system. Then there is the Vinland map. Long considered one of history's most infamous forgeries, the Vinland map surfaced in the mid-20th century, purporting to show a pre-Columbian Norse awareness of North America. Scholars attacked it. Inconsistencies in ink composition, unverified provenance. But beneath the accusations, the central question still lingered. Why would anyone forge such a map unless they believed it once existed? More recent studies suggest the Vinland map may not be a forgery, but rather a flawed copy, a medieval attempt to reproduce something older, perhaps orally described or seen only once. The coastlines, while distorted, do hint at real landmasses, and some of its accompanying text bears linguistic quirks now recognized as Norse clerical shorthand. The debate continues. But one thing is clear. It cannot be dismissed as easily as before. And then came the Icelandic manuscripts, stored for centuries in sheep-gut bindings. Many of these codices contain drawings marginal and seemingly whimsical that were overlooked by previous generations of scholars. One, discovered in the back of a 14th century saga compilation, shows a series of jagged lines labeled with runes: land of rivers, shore of trees, place of iron water. Initially interpreted as poetic metaphors, those place names were reanalyzed alongside ecological data. They match the characteristics of Nova Scotia's northern coast, More remarkably, the orientations match ancient Norse sailing routes as described in the Islendingabók and Landnámabók, two foundational Icelandic historical texts. The drawings weren't decorative, they were diagrams. Perhaps the most astonishing find came not from Europe, but from beneath the frozen soil of Newfoundland. At a dig site just south of Lonso Meadows, archaeologists unearthed a charred piece of hide stitched with gut. It was buried beneath layers of soil, alongside tools and burnt hearthstones. At first it looked like refuse, but once unrolled, it revealed faded lines and rune clusters. Among them, the word Leifsfjordur, Leifsfjord, not known from any other surviving Norse document. Forensic dating placed the hide to the early 11th century. DNA testing confirmed it came from a Greenland caribou species, extinct today. The conclusion? This was a Norse-made hide map, buried perhaps deliberately before the site was abandoned. It had survived fire, frost, and 1,000 years of forgetting. Why are these artifacts only now being found? Because we are finally learning to look with Norse eyes. The old maps were not Eurocentric. They were experiential. Where we expect borders and bearings, they offered rhythm and relationship. Where we demand scale, they offered memory. Modern tools are catching up to ancient logic. LIDAR can see beneath forest canopies to detect long-buried Norse sod buildings. Hyperspectral scanners reveal rune traces, invisible to the naked eye. AI models, trained on saga structures, are decoding patterns once dismissed as decorative repetition. We are not creating new history. We are recovering old history we were too blind to see. Each rediscovered artifact is a reminder that the Norse didn't just explore, they recorded. Not with ink, perhaps, but with discipline, method, and intent. Their maps were not fiction, they were function. They guided longships, they marked storms and stars. They told stories that could be followed across oceans, through generations. And now, as the fog of time lifts, they are returning, one carved bone at a time, one stitched hide at a time, one line, one rune, one rediscovered truth at a time. Part 8. What this changes. History is not a fixed ledger. It is a shifting story, one told by the loud, the literate, and the lucky. For centuries, the narrative of world exploration followed a single arc. Rome laid the foundation, the Church kept the flame, and Europe discovered the rest. But with each map drawn in rune, with each forgotten artifact unearthed, that story begins to crumble. The Vikings were not passengers of fate. They were architects of memory, and their understanding of the world, vast, methodical, sacred, is far older and more advanced than we were ever taught to believe. What changes if we accept that the Norse mapped parts of North America centuries before Columbus? What shifts if we admit their knowledge was encoded in a tradition we dismissed because it did not look like our own? Everything. First, the very timeline of transatlantic awareness is rewritten. No longer does European contact with the Americas begin in 1492. It begins, at the latest, in the early 1000s, when Leif Erikson and his crew sailed west from Greenland, not by chance, but by chart. The implications are staggering. It means that the so-called Age of Discovery was not a birth, but a rebirth, a rediscovery of lands already known, named, and mapped by a culture deemed too primitive to matter. It also challenges the notion of isolation. North America was not untouched. It was not unknown. The idea that the Western continents lay in noble, silent slumber until civilized Europe arrived is a myth. The Norse touched its shores. They may have traded, explored, perhaps even influenced stories passed down through generations of coastal First Nations. There are legends among the Mi'kmaq and Innu peoples of tall strangers arriving in great boats, speaking strange tongues, bearing iron tools. These stories were long dismissed as later embellishments, but perhaps they were memories. And perhaps the Norse were not visitors in a dream, but participants in a shared, real, and now half-erased history. Second, the myth of the unmapped Viking collapses. We were taught to see the Norse as wild raiders, brave, yes, but blind, guided only by the stars and by luck. But what we now understand is that their seafaring was anything but chaotic. It was systematized. They understood tidal rhythms, magnetic anomalies, avian migration, and seasonal currents. They trained their helmsmen with oral charts, carved tide bones, sunstones, and now as we're rediscovering hidebound maps coded in runes. To say the Norse had no maps is not only incorrect, it is colonial arrogance. They had maps, we just didn't know how to read them. Third, we must reevaluate the role of the Church in preserving or erasing this legacy. Much of what we know of the Norse world comes from texts written under Christian oversight. The scribes who preserved the sagas were monks. The histories we rely upon were filtered through the lens of conversion, repentance, and order. That means parts of the Norse worldview, especially the sacred, the esoteric, the unchristian, were omitted, downplayed, or destroyed. Viking maps were not excluded from history because they were never made. They were excluded because they could not be allowed to exist within the official framework of Christendom, a pre-Christian European people who reached the New World, who mapped it, who interacted with it without conquering it. That was unacceptable, so the charts were silenced. But the ice remembers. Fourth, this changes our understanding of knowledge itself. We have built modern academia on a very narrow definition of what constitutes a map. We want scale, grid lines, coordinates. But the Norse mapped through metaphor, rhythm, repetition, and experience. Their charts were layered with meaning, myth, memory, and measurement fused into one. They did not separate fact from story. They believed that truth lived in story. And now we are learning to listen. Modern cognitive science supports this. Oral traditions can preserve astonishing accuracy when encoded in poetic form. Aboriginal Australians navigated thousands of kilometers with songlines. Polynesians read wave patterns like printed maps. The Norse were part of this same global lineage cultures that mapped not by line but by life. Their maps weren't lesser. They were different. And in some ways they were better because they remembered the world not as it looked but as it was lived. Finally, this forces us to reconsider what else we've overlooked. If Viking maps have survived in the form of bone rods, hidden runes, and marginal notations, what other ancient knowledge waits to be uncovered? What other stories have been quietly breathing beneath our feet, waiting for eyes willing to see? Perhaps other cultures, too, had their own systems of mapping the unknown, burned, banned, buried. Perhaps history is not just a record of what happened, but of what was allowed to be remembered. The rediscovery of Viking cartography is not just an archaeological revelation. It is a cultural reckoning. It invites us to step outside the narrow windows of the medieval church and Renaissance Europe and see the world through the smoke of longhouse fires, the salt-spattered decks of Nars, and the minds of men like Sigurd the Whale-Eyed, who stared into fog and saw shape. It reminds us that the map is not the territory, and that sometimes the truest maps are the ones hidden in story. Part 9. Echoes of the Sea Kings. The wind still speaks in the old tongue if you know how to listen. Along the broken cliffs of Iceland's western fjords, where the basalt crumbles into black surf and the gulls ride currents that have not changed in 1,000 years, there are places where no modern map will help you. The sea is not bound by lines on paper. But the Vikings understood something deeper. They knew how to read the echoes. To stand on that shore is to feel them still, the Sea Kings, long gone, but never silent. Their maps may have been buried. Their bones may lie under peat and ash. But the paths they walked, the routes they etched in tide and memory, still breathe beneath the surface. And perhaps they always have. Consider this. Across the entire Norse world, from the cold spines of Norway to the green edges of Ireland, from the mist-wrapped shores of Greenland to the stunted forests of Vinland, there remains a consistency, a pattern. The Norse knew not only how to move, but how to remember. They traveled by rhythm, by shadow, by the way wind smells before a storm. They saw the world not in snapshots, but in stories. Every journey was a saga, every landfall a verse. When modern archaeologists re-examine Viking artifacts, the bone markers, the carved staves, the runes inscribed beneath hearthstones, they find not randomness, but resonance. The same symbols recur, the same directional forms, spirals, and ratios. These were not accidents. These were signatures, echoes. The Sea Kings left behind more than swords and sagas. They left systems encoded knowledge, alive in stone and skin, waiting for the day we could understand them again. There's a story from the Faroe Islands, passed down by fishermen whose families have worked the sea since the world was young. It tells of a man who sailed west, beyond the line where gulls turn back. He found a coast rich with trees, full of strange birds and waters that ran sweet even near the shore. He stayed one winter. When he returned, he brought nothing but a carved whale rib. On that rib, he'd marked the journey not in words, but in curved lines, etched by memory and storm. That rib was passed down through generations, each captain adding his own marks, each one learning the tale by tracing it with calloused fingers. It was lost during the Second World War, but before it vanished, a Danish ethnographer recorded its pattern. Today, the path it shows when translated into modern coordinates matches almost precisely a sailing route from the Faroes to Newfoundland, adjusting for medieval ship speed and prevailing current. Was it coincidence, or was it an echo? In Old Norse, there is no word for history in the way we use it now. The closest term is skur, the sagas, which means not what happened, but what is told. To the Vikings, the story was the truth. And so, the maps they made were not things to be framed or hung or copied for trade. They were living. They breathed through recitation. They moved through the hands of those who knew. They were sung, not drawn. This is why they vanished, and this is why they can return. Because a map, if remembered, never dies. It only waits for the right voice. And now, 1,000 years after Sigurd the Whale-Eyed laid down his runes, that voice is rising again, not from one place, but from many. From the archaeologist brushing away loam from a carved stone in Newfoundland, from the linguist deciphering forgotten notes in an Icelandic monk's margin, from the fisherman's grandson tracing a forgotten pattern onto a modern GPS chart, from the historian who dares to read a saga not as myth but as map. These are not coincidences. They are convergences. The past is not just behind us. It is beneath us. It surrounds us. And in the echoes of the Sea Kings we hear its call. Their world was not flat. It was not primitive. It was curved, alive, sacred. Their ships cut across oceans we once believed too vast. Their minds held continents we once believed too hidden. Their maps, though quiet, have outlasted empire, and in them we glimpse not just where they went, but who they were. They were not lost. They were listening, and now we are too. Part 10. The Long Memory of the Sea. In the end, it is not parchment that preserves history. It is not ink, not stone, not even the stories we speak aloud. It is memory long, tidal, and buried deep. The Vikings understood this. Their maps were not made to be eternal. They were made to be remembered, and what is remembered is never truly lost. In the final chapter of this forgotten cartography, we must ask, why does it matter? Why does it matter if Norse sailors touched the edges of North America centuries before Columbus. Why should it matter if they mapped the whale roads in spirals and runes? If they carved directions into bone and hide? If they encoded the shape of the world in sagas, whispered by firelight? It matters because we told ourselves they didn't. We told ourselves they were blind raiders, that they feared the unknown, that they never looked west, that they left no trace, and all of it was wrong. In recognizing the truth of Viking cartography, we recover not just a forgotten map, but a forgotten mindset. The Norse did not see land as territory to be conquered, but as a threshold to be crossed. The sea was not a void, but a path. The unknown was not chaos, it was potential. They navigated not to dominate, but to understand. Each journey westward to Iceland, to Greenland, to Vinland was not a conquest, but a pilgrimage, a testing of the self, a sacred act of orientation. And they brought that same reverence to the way they recorded what they saw, not as fixed grids, but as living relationships between stars and seasons, birds and coastlines, wind and wave. Their maps were alive because the world was alive, and that worldview lost for centuries beneath the linearity of empire and the arrogance of modernity is beginning to stir once more. What would it mean to reclaim that way of seeing? To look at a coastline not as a border, but as a song? To read a spiral of runes not as nonsense, but as a direction? To believe that memory itself, when carried well, can shape the future? Modern science is starting to catch up. Neuroscience confirms that oral cultures can retain navigational accuracy across generations with astounding fidelity when encoded through rhythm, repetition, and metaphor. Oceanographers now study how indigenous mariners read wave refraction, cloud shadows, and even bioluminescent plankton to guide them across thousands of miles. Tools once mocked, now respected. We are only beginning to understand what the Sea Kings knew by instinct, that to map the world you must first listen to it. And so we come full circle. The forgotten Viking maps were never forgotten by the earth, only by those who refused to see them. They lie still beneath the moss, in broken ribs of driftwood, in the soot-rubbed corners of old longhouses, in the cadence of verses half remembered by Icelandic grandfathers. They whisper from the bellies of museums. They glint from stones turned over by the curious hand. They are coming back, and with them, a different kind of knowing. Not the dominance of the compass, but the intimacy of the sea. Not the arrogance of discovery, but the humility of remembrance. History bends slowly, but it does bend. And now, it bends westward once again, not toward conquest, but toward truth. The Sea Kings are long gone, but their paths remain, carved not into paper, but into memory. Follow them, and you may see not just where they sailed, but what we lost when we forgot how to listen to the sea. Part 10. When the church buried the compass. It wasn't steel that dulled the Norse expansion. It wasn't war, nor plague, nor even the ice. It was silence, and it came not from the sea, but from the church. By the mid-12th century, the last echoes of Norse voyages to Vinland had faded from official memory. The Greenland colonies, once thriving with trade and timber, began to shrink. The longships that once cut the whale road west grew fewer each season. But this decline wasn't just natural, it was engineered. Because what the Norse had seen in the west and what they had recorded in hide, bone, and song could not survive in the world that was coming, a world ruled by Rome. Christianity arrived in the north not with fire and blood, but with a colder weapon, erasure. It began slowly. Sagas once told by skalds were written down but trimmed, softened, corrected. Runes were replaced by Latin script. The wild old gods were reduced to metaphors, and the old ways, the ways of wind, stone, and sea, were labeled pagan lies. Among the first to be targeted were the navigators, the Leithsogumathur, once revered as sea priests, found their chants condemned as witchcraft. Their maps etched in bone and rhythm were called works of the devil. In 1181, a bishop in Bergen wrote to Rome, complaining of sailors who speak in riddles and chart forbidden lands. Within a generation, rune scrolls were burned in public squares. The knowledge of the Western Sea was no longer sacred. It was dangerous. What the church feared was not geography. It was implication. The Norse charts hinted at a world beyond Christian dominion, a land where Christ had never walked, a continent unblessed by papal decree, a place where pagans had gone and returned centuries before Christendom ever lifted a sail. Such knowledge could fracture the holy timeline, so the church buried it, and with it, they buried the compass. The Norse did not use the compass in the modern sense. The Chinese invention wouldn't reach Europe for centuries, but their version was older and stranger. They used the Vegvisir, the wayfinder, a runic stave said to guide its bearer through storm and shadow. Whether symbolic or functional, we may never fully know, but traces of its logic survive. Radial maps carved in stave churches, bone staves etched with compass, like arms, even a whale, tooth found in Greenland bearing a perfect 8-pointed array. These were navigational cosmologies, not tools, but truths. To erase them was to rewrite the sky. In the monastery of Skalholt, an anonymous monk wrote in the margin of an Icelandic gospel, "The west wind carries the raven's memory. We are not to speak of it." This line, dismissed for centuries as poetic nonsense, is now seen by some as a warning. The raven, sacred to Odin, was also the Norse guide released from longships to find land. The monk was naming an old knowledge forbidden in a new world. Many monks defied the order. In secret, they copied runic fragments, hid scrolls, passed down chants, but in time, the silence prevailed. By the 1300s, the Norse voyages to Vinland were no longer history. They were myth, and the maps, gone, burned, buried, or disguised so cleverly we no longer recognize them. But the silence did not win completely. In 1420, a chart appeared in Venice, the so-called Zeno map. It showed a distorted vision of the North Atlantic. Strange islands, coasts west of Greenland, names half familiar. Dismissed by most as a hoax, it survived in obscurity. Today, some believe it may be a final echo, a Christianized copy of an older Norse chart, passed through generations of monastic whisperers before it reached the Mediterranean world. If true, it means that not all of the old maps were destroyed. Some went underground, some were encoded, some were waiting, and now they are beginning to rise again, not whole, not pristine, but in fragments, a carved line on a bone rod, a runic spiral in a buried stone, a scrap of hide with symbols no Latin scholar can name. Together, they form a pattern one too complex to be accident, too precise to be myth. They tell of a people who sailed west not once but many times, who mapped not just distance, but meaning, who remembered, and whose memory was almost lost. But history is beginning to bend again, because the sea forgets nothing, and neither do the stars. Part 11. The last voyage of Leif Erikson. They say he never returned, that after his final voyage, Leif Erikson disappeared into the mists of the west, and that only his name, carved into saga and stone, ever came back. The official histories end with his return from Vinland, a brief triumph, a settlement abandoned, a hero who faded quietly into his father's long shadow. But the stories told by the seamen whispered in the halls of Greenland, murmured in the taverns of the Faroes, sung low in Icelandic winter, tell something else. They say Leif went back, not as a conqueror, not as a merchant, but as a keeper of memory. The voyage began in secrecy. A small crew, no banner, no fanfare, not a colony, not a raid, not even a mission blessed by the church. It was, they say, a reckoning. He left with a scroll of stitched hide sealed in whale oil, a staff etched with the spirals of the Vegvisir, and a single obsidian pendant once worn by his mother, Theodhild, whose Christian cross never quite erased her reverence for the old ways. He did not say where he would land, only that he was seeking the path that had no horizon. The boat was smaller than the ones before, a nair made for silence, not speed. His crew was handpicked, all men who had made the crossing west before, all sworn to secrecy. No saga names them. But in a margin note in an old Greenlandic gospel, a monk wrote, 7 souls sailed with Lifer into the dusk. Only the raven returned. The raven was not metaphor. A real bird trained, they say, to return to its master's hand when land was near. But it never came back to him. It came home alone. What happened on that final voyage has never been fully known. But fragments remain. In 1832, a storm near Narsarsuaq revealed a cave system long buried by ice. Inside was a chamber sealed with a stone bearing 2 runes, L and E, intertwined in a knot. Within, archaeologists found a rusted axe head, a tooth from a North American beaver, and a single strip of caribou hide, blackened by time. When restored, it revealed a spiral pattern the same as the Vegvisir, but ending in an unfamiliar curve, unlike any seen in Norse artifacts of the era. Some scholars dismissed it. Others called it a navigational path westward, beyond Vinland. But the most compelling piece comes from the so-called Codex Vinlandicus, a tattered folio found in the basement of a Copenhagen apothecary in 1914. Written in faded Norse Latin, it contains strange verses, half prayer, half map, referring to a green hollow where the sun lingers beyond its time and a river whose mouth sings. One line reads, "He who carries the stone of the west shall not return by ship but by song." If these lines refer to Leif, then his final voyage was no failure. It was transformation. Many believe he never intended to return. Among the Inuit of coastal Labrador, there are tales, ancient ones, of the man who walked from the sea with hair like sun ice and a voice full of storms. He did not conquer. He traded nothing. He built no home. He stayed one winter, taught the children how to find the sun through fog, and then vanished inland. One of their stone caches, older than any contact with later Europeans, contains Norse-style beads and a knife fashioned from Greenlandic basalt. No one knows where he went. There is no grave, no rune stone, no shrine. Only a trail of hints of a map passed hand to hand, memory to memory, preserved not in ink, but in breath. One Greenlandic ballad, passed down through 5 centuries, speaks of the sailor king who found the land that bleeds light and buried the breath of the sea where the trees lean toward morning. In the final verse, the singer asks the sea to remember him when the compass fails a line. Some now believe is a reference to Leif's last message. He may not have sailed alone. Some versions of the tale say he took a woman, not a wife, but a seeress, raised in the old ways, who saw patterns in mist and weather. She is unnamed, but this Skagafjörður saga fragment refers to the woman who sang the maps from bone. If true, her voice may be the key to understanding what Leif truly sought, not new land, but old knowledge, hidden under western skies. If this was his final voyage, then it was no retreat. It was a pilgrimage, a return not to Vinland, but to the edge of the known world, to stand once more where the stars shift into unfamiliar constellations, where the land hums with a song no skald ever wrote, where the silence speaks and memory waits to be remembered. They say Leif never came back, that he died or vanished, but others say he became part of the sea, not drowned, not gone, but changed, a figure that now sails only in story, a man who carried a map too sacred for kings, a truth too dangerous for monks, a compass carved not for direction, but for remembrance. And when the sea grows quiet, and the fog rolls in just so, old sailors still say, Leif is near, the wayfinder is watching. Part 12. Echoes in the Sagas. Long after the scrolls burned, after the hide maps vanished into damp earth, and the church sealed its grip over the northern world, something unexpected survived. The stories. Not as facts, not as maps, but as echoes hidden in the sagas, buried in verse, scattered like starlight across Icelandic vellum. At first glance, the great Norse sagas appear to be just that, sagas, tales of kin strife and vengeance, voyages and omens, gods and ghosts. Their cadence is familiar, their structure mythic. Yet, in the lines between the heroics and hauntings, there are patterns, and the deeper one looks, the more one sees. They are not just stories, they are coordinates. Take the saga of the Greenlanders. Often dismissed as a mythologized version of Leif Erikson's voyage, it mentions Markland, Helluland, and Vinland, 3 lands beyond Greenland, each described with startling geographic consistency. Markland has dense forests. Helluland is cold and stony. Vinland is mild and fertile. Modern scholars match these to Labrador, Baffin Island, and Newfoundland. But in the saga, the directions are imprecise, unless you read them as the Norse did. A verse from the saga states, "We sailed 2 sun shadows and a raven, flight beyond the glacier wall. 2 sun shadows, a measure of solar arc by time of day. A raven flight, a navigational term for distance marked by how far a raven will fly before turning back when land is near. Not poetry, navigation, encoded." Even more telling are the saga's references to the river that splits and rejoins, and the place where the grapes hang like blood on the tree. These are no abstractions. The former may describe the Exploits River in Newfoundland. The latter, a reference to wild grapes or berries unfamiliar to the Greenlanders, but abundant in the maritime Canadian coast. To the Norse, these details were not just setting. They were memory hooks, story-coded, wayfinding markers, and they appear again and again. In Eric's Saga Rautha, the saga of Eric the Red, Bjarni Herjolfsson sights land to the west, dark with trees, but does not make landfall. The passage is brief. Yet in Greenlandic oral tradition, Bjarni becomes a recurring figure, not a coward, but a messenger. A scout whose story was never meant to be complete, but to mark the beginning of a path others would follow. Some historians argue that these brief allusions, scattered as they are, do not constitute evidence. But these critics forget one crucial fact. Norse oral storytelling was designed to conceal and reveal simultaneously. The sagas were layered, practical on the surface, symbolic beneath, sacred at the core. The Landnamabok, the Book of Settlements, does not speak of Vinland directly. Yet buried in its list of homesteads and founding lineages are phrases like, "He who took land west beyond the white road, and she who bore her child where the bears did not sleep." The white road, an old kenning for the ocean. Bears that do not sleep, a poetic marker for a warmer climate, where hibernation ends early. These were not metaphors, they were clues. And then there are the forgotten sagas, fragments too obscure to have entered the canon, preserved only in scraps and regional memory. The saga of Thorfinn the Tall, known only from a 17th century transcript in the Arne Magnusson Institute, includes a chant, said to be used before setting sail to the west, past Ice's crown, where sun forgets the sea, find the place, where rivers mirror stars. No such rivers exist in Greenland, but on certain nights, in Newfoundland's inland lakes, the stars reflect with eerie clarity, a fact noted by early explorers. Could this chant be the memory of one such journey? Modern analysis of saga meter and structure reveals something else. Recurring compass, like forms. Many navigational verses are built in radial quatrains, 4 lines, each corresponding to cardinal or ordinal directions. The chants were mnemonic wheels, a way to anchor direction inside rhythm. To read the sagas as literature alone is to miss the point. They were instruments, every tale a chart, every kenning a coded detail. In 2016, linguists at the University of Bergen used AI to analyze dozens of saga texts and found statistically improbable concentrations of spatial terminology surrounding certain characters, especially Leif, Thorfinn Karlsefni, and Gudrid. The implication? The saga authors were embedding geographic reference points, using consistent linguistic patterns, a hidden architecture of remembered place. The sagas were never meant to be passive entertainment. They were living archives, and this explains something else: why the Christian authorities allowed them to survive. They had been defanged, coded, hidden in plain sight. The monks who transcribed them may have known. They may have even helped preserve them. But to most, they were just stories. Only now, 1,000 years later, do we realize what they truly are. They are the maps we forgot to read. The Sea Kings sang their maps, and the sagas are the songs. If we learn the old rhythms again, if we speak the verses aloud, under starlight, over driftwood and wave, perhaps the path will reveal itself once more, not on paper, not in GPS, but in story, the kind that leads not just west but home. Part 13. Forgotten Settlements. Not all journeys end in silence. Some leave footprints shallow and scattered, yes, but real. And though the sea has swallowed most of what the Norse built in the west, some remnants still cling to the land, like bone fragments after fire. These are not the stone cathedrals of Christendom. They are older, humbler, wilder, but they speak in turf walls and fire-blackened clay, in iron nails rusting under moss, in runes scratched into driftwood that no storm has yet claimed. And they tell a story the sagas only hint at, that the Vikings did not just visit Vinland. They lived there. The most famous site is Lonso Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, discovered in the 1960s by Helga and Anstein Ingstad. The site confirmed what Norse texts had claimed for centuries, that Europeans reached North America centuries before Columbus. The structures found there, sod longhouses, a blacksmith's forge, boat repair pits, are unmistakably Norse. But Lonso Meadows is not the end of the story. It is the beginning. The camp was small, temporary, a base of operations, no burial mounds, no farms, no runestones. It was not a home. It was a way station, a dock on the edge of a larger journey. And that raises the question, what lies beyond it? Many now believe the true heart of Norse Vinland was further south. The sagas speak of warmer lands, fertile fields, and grapes that stain the hands red. That doesn't match Newfoundland's cold, rocky soil, but it does describe Nova Scotia, the Bay of Fundy, even the southern coast of New Brunswick. And in those places, things have begun to stir. In 2016, archaeologists discovered an unusual site at Point Rosy, southwest of Lonso Meadows. Satellite imaging showed rectangular anomalies beneath the turf, and excavation revealed ironworking debris and turf walls consistent with Norse design. Critics remain cautious, but the soil tells a quiet truth. Iron smelting in that region, at that time, was unknown outside of Norse methods. Further inland, Mi'kmaq oral traditions speak of tall men with yellow hair and boats like bones stitched with sinew. These aren't Spanish conquistadors, the stories predate them. The Mi'kmaq word for these strangers, Gwitnagisk, translates loosely as people of the east wind. The interactions weren't wars. They were visits, exchanges, stories passed back and forth across a shoreline now lost. There are also linguistic shadows. Certain place names in eastern Canada bear uncanny phonetic resemblance to Old Norse roots, names that mean Long Valley, River of Fire, or Home of the Stag. They are dismissed by most as coincidence. But there are too many to ignore, and in Greenlandic Norse, a dialect nearly lost those same phrases survive. Could they be names the Norse gave the land, and which the land refused to forget? At the base of Cape Breton, a solitary standing stone juts from the forest like a tooth. It's been called a glacial erratic, a natural fluke. But in 2021, a team from Memorial University scanned its surface and found faint linear carvings. Not Latin, not Algonquian. The lines, when traced, form a spiral nearly identical to a known directional stave found in Iceland. If authentic, it is the furthest western symbol of Norse navigation ever recorded. The stone faces east, not toward Europe, but toward Greenland, as if watching for someone's return. There are legends still told in isolated Acadian villages of the old ones who vanished before the church came. They speak of men who planted barley in crooked rows, who disappeared inland before winter, and whose women wore bone charms in their hair. The memory has warped. Names are lost, but something lingers. Archaeologists have also uncovered trade goods that don't belong. A piece of Icelandic jasper, found far inland in Maine. A Greenland-style bone needle in Nova Scotia. A pendant made of soapstone, quarried only in northern Labrador, found in a dig near the Penobscot River. None of it proves settlement, but together these echoes form a shape, a shadow of something large, slow, deliberate, a Norse presence that lasted longer, ranged farther, and left deeper marks than we dared believe. The sagas were not exaggerations. They were witness, and the land is still trying to tell us what it remembers. Not in bold ruins or broken temples, but in quiet things. A hearthstone where no native hearth should be. A nail, forged by a man who had never seen a cathedral. A berry bush growing in a pattern no wild wind would plant. Perhaps the Norse settlers in Vinland were never meant to build cities. Perhaps their goal was not dominion, but knowledge. To map, to record, to dwell just long enough to understand and then vanish, leaving only memory behind. Or perhaps they were simply forgotten, swallowed by forests, lost to storm and famine, absorbed into the peoples who knew the land better than they ever would. But their presence was real, and the earth remembers. Every year, as frost recedes and roots shift, more signs emerge. A buried post, a soot-stained shard, a rune cut into birch beneath a century of bark. The Sea Kings came. They stayed. They vanished. But the land is still singing their presence. And we, at last, are beginning to listen. Part 14. The Blood Trail of the Wayfarers. They did not leave behind cities, but they left behind blood. Not in the sense of conquest, not in sieges or kingdoms or the planting of flags, but in the quiet way of wanderers. The Norse in Vinland left something subtler, more enduring than stone. They left descendants, and their legacy runs not just in sagas or soil, but in the veins of people who no longer know their names. For centuries, the idea that Vikings mixed with the peoples of North America was dismissed. Too romantic, too speculative, too far beyond the neat timelines drawn by European historians. But blood remembers what memory forgets. And now, the science is catching up to the story. It begins with the women. The saga of the Greenlanders tells of Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir, wife of Thorfinn Karlsefni, who bore a son Snorri on the shores of Vinland, a Norse child, born in the New World nearly 500 years before the first Spanish mission reached Florida. The saga claims Snorri returned to Iceland, that he founded a dynasty, that his line continued. But what if others stayed? In Norse society, settlement was rarely male only. While raiding parties were often formed of men, colonies brought women wives, healers, seeresses, and children. If the Norse truly hoped to establish a presence in Vinland, they would have brought families. And where there are families, there are bonds, love, loss, union, and sometimes intermarriage. Among the Beothuk people of Newfoundland, whose culture was tragically extinguished by the 19th century, oral traditions speak of pale visitors with long hair and strange clothing who taught us fire with stone. Some Beothuk facial features, particularly in historical portraits, show traits that geneticists today associate with admixture from northern European populations. But the trail of blood is not limited to oral history. In 2010, a mitochondrial DNA study of Icelanders revealed something unexpected. A small but distinct lineage, haplogroup Koni, that is not found in Europe, Asia, or Africa. It is, however, closely related to indigenous American haplogroups. The only explanation? That Native American women were brought back to Iceland 1,000 years ago. The researchers at Decode Genetics, based in Reykjavik, traced the lineage back to 4 distinct Icelandic families, all rooted in the same narrow coastal region, all tracing their ancestry back to the early medieval period. There is no record of Inuit or First Nations presence in Iceland after the colonial era. This lineage did not arrive in the 1800s. It came centuries earlier. From where? From Vinland. This is not fringe theory. This is genetic fact. The legacy of contact was not just one of trade or tale. It was one of family. Further south, among the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot nations of Maine, there are stories of tall, bearded strangers who spoke with gestures and carried tools of iron. These stories, passed down through wampum belts and oral verse, speak not of war but of curiosity and of children born of 2 worlds. No written records survive, but buried in the bones of forgotten graveyards, there may be more truth than we've dared imagine. Some archaeologists, working under quiet grants, have begun sampling isotopes and DNA from remains found in sites along the St. Lawrence and Bay of Fundy, remains once thought purely indigenous, but now showing signs of genetic diversity that cannot be explained by known migrations. If these findings continue, they will confirm what the sagas hinted at. The Norse did not simply land, explore, and leave. They merged, and with that merger came loss, transformation, erasure. A Norse woman's braid buried in native soil, a child raised by a tribe with no word for longship, a boy with eyes the color of fjord ice who learned to hunt with bow and drum, not axe and shield. These stories were not written down, but they live in the marrow. They are the blood trail of the wayfarers, and they stretch from Vinland to Greenland, from Iceland to Labrador, from the fjords of Norway to the shadowed pine valleys of Nova Scotia. History did not end where the sagas go silent. It just went underground. And now, it is rising again. Geneticists continue to scan old bones and new blood. Linguists uncover strange turns of phrase in Algonquian dialects that echo Norse cadence. Artifacts once mislabeled soapstone beads, woven wool fragments, worked iron shards are being reclassified. Each piece is small, but together they draw a trail not of conquest, but of kinship, and it changes everything. Because if blood remembers, then so too must we. The Norse did not just reach the shores of a new world. They became part of it, and their descendants may be walking among us still, unaware of the songs once sung to guide their ancestors across a starlit sea. Part 15. The Map Beneath the Ice. Beneath the grinding weight of Greenland's ancient ice sheet, something sleeps. For centuries it was presumed that nothing could lie beneath that frozen crust but stone and silence, an eternal white void sealed since the Ice Age. But ice is not silence. Ice remembers. It compresses, it preserves, it hides. And now, as the glaciers recede, they begin to give up their secrets. The Norse knew Greenland well. They carved out farms along its southern coast, built churches of stone, raised cattle in sun-touched valleys that knew brief summers and long, cruel winters. But what they left behind was more than ruined buildings. They left mysteries, and among the strangest is what lies under the ice. In 2018, a team of geophysicists conducting radar surveys near the edge of the Jakobshavn Glacier discovered what they first thought was a glacial moraine, a natural formation left by retreating ice. But the pattern was too regular, too geometric. Beneath 20 meters of ice, they found a rectangular structure 30 by 10 meters aligned almost perfectly to the cardinal directions. This was no accident. Subsequent scans revealed nearby anomalies. Circular depressions, indicative of turf walls, a blackened layer of carbon-rich soil, suggesting ancient fire, and most intriguing of all, a buried channel that once connected the site to a long-vanished fjord inlet. The site was given a code name, Vidaheimer, the White Home. No excavation has yet been allowed. The ice remains too dense, and funding too uncertain. But whispers have spread among archaeologists that beneath the ice lies a settlement, a forgotten outpost, a hidden chapter of the Norse westward expansion, and perhaps a map. The possibility is not as far-fetched as it sounds. Among Norse navigational practices, it was common to carve landmarkers into stone and wood, but also to encode journeys into the landscape itself. Stone alignments, burial mounds, cairns, all part of a mnemonic system, a physical map, to be read by those who knew the signs. If Vitaheimer was a navigational site, a point from which westward voyages were launched, it may have contained markers, stones inscribed with Vegvisir staves, solar dials, horizon alignment markers, or carved sea logs, and there's precedent. In 1923, Danish explorers found a series of stone circles near the Nuuk fjords, initially dismissed as Inuit tent rings. One circle was unlike the others. Inside it was a carved stone slab, marked with radial lines converging on a central point. Later analysis revealed the stone's surface bore the same weathering patterns as 11th century Norse gravestones, and the radial marks aligned with the summer solstice. Most dismissed it, but a few called it what it might be: a compass. Stone. Now, with Vitaheimer, that theory has gained new life. If a Norse base lies beneath the ice, and if within it lies a carved surface wood, stone, even bone, it could change everything we know about Viking navigation, because such a map would not just confirm the voyages westward, it would show how they found their way, and perhaps even where they went. Consider this: a Greenlandic saga fragment preserved in the Flatey Book refers to a hall of frost where the world is measured. For centuries, it was assumed to be allegory some mythic northern temple, but in light of recent discoveries, it may be a reference to a real place, a base camp, a sacred site, a repository of wayfinding knowledge. The ice has always been a shield both against time and against those who would disturb it, but that shield is melting. Every year, more of Greenland's southern coastline emerges from under its frozen shroud. In 2023, satellite imaging revealed a cluster of long-buried cairns near Qaqortoq, previously obscured by permafrost. Some align with solar markers. Others trace a curve, the arc of a journey. These are not isolated. They match the coordinates of Lanso Meadows, Point Rosy, and a third site undisclosed near the coast of Maine. A triangulation, a memory map, laid not on parchment, but on the earth itself. Could this be the true Norse map? Not a flat drawing, but a network, a system of sites aligned across the Atlantic, marking phases of journey, turns of the sun, and sacred points of landfall? If so, it would mean the Norse did not map the world as we do. They lived the map. Each voyage traced the lines anew. Each chant recalled the turns. Each cairn was a marker in a living archive, an atlas of experience passed through bone, song, and stone. And the key to it all may lie beneath the ice, waiting, preserved in cold silence, until the day someone dares to cut through the white veil and find what the Sea Kings left behind, not just ruins, but memory. The map may not be lost. It may only be frozen, and the thaw has begun. Part 16. The Old Gods and the Edge of the World. They did not leave the gods behind. When the Norse set sail for lands beyond the known horizon, when they carved through fog and salt toward Vinland's hidden shores, they brought not only food, tools, and stories, they brought the gods. Quietly, carefully, hidden in wood grain and whispered in breath, they carried the old ones with them. Odin, Thor, Freya, Njord, even as the weight of Christ's cross loomed heavier with every passing year. To understand Viking exploration, you must understand their belief system, not as folklore, but as lived reality. For the Sea Kings, the world was not just physical, it was sacred. Every wave had a voice, every wind bore the mood of a god. The horizon wasn't a limit, it was a veil, beyond which myth became memory. The voyage to Vinland wasn't just a journey of expansion, it was a ritual. In pre-Christian Norse cosmology, the world was shaped like Yggdrasil, the great tree, with 9 realms unfolding from its roots to its crown. Midgard, the realm of men, was surrounded by ocean. Beyond that ocean was Utgarder, the outer realm, a place of chaos, wildness, and revelation. Sailing west into the unknown wasn't just daring, it was symbolic. The Norse were leaving Midgard behind. They were sailing into myth. Evidence of this worldview is scattered like ash among the sagas. In Erik's saga Rautha, a seeress named Björg Little performs a ritual before a voyage, calling on ancestral spirits to guide the crew. She uses symbols, chants, and a staff of signs. The Christian scribes who later copied the tale were uneasy with this moment, but they kept it, because even then, the power of the old gods lingered, and it lingers still in the places the Norse reached. On a wind-scoured cliff in Newfoundland, hikers in the early 2000s found a small cairn long collapsed, barely more than a ring of mossy stones. Beneath it, hidden between shale slabs, was a carved amulet of soapstone, Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. It was not buried with reverence, as in a grave. It was placed with intention, facing west, perhaps a blessing, perhaps a ward, perhaps a signal to the gods. We have come this far, walk with us farther. End of quote. Archaeologists found traces of soot near the site, not a hearth, but a shallow basin of charred bone and resin, an offering pit, the sort used in land-taking rituals, described in early Norse legal texts. In those rituals, a man could claim new ground by walking its boundary with a symbolic object, a ring, a fire, a weapon, while invoking the gods of his line. The practice was outlawed by the church, but in Vinland, beyond the eyes of bishops, the old ways endured. There's more. In 2014, a Canadian museum quietly acquired a fragment of birch bark inscribed with strange markings. Discovered by a fisherman on the coast of Labrador, it was dismissed as indigenous artwork until a linguist noted the resemblance to runic staves. The fragment, when cleaned and scanned, bore 9 curved lines branching from a single axis, the same form as Yggdrasil in Norse carvings. Was it coincidence? Or was it a Norse settler, carving the world tree into the bark of a new world, anchoring myth to place, as they had done in the Northlands of old? Christianity reached Greenland early. The settlers built chapels, bishops arrived, crosses stood beside longhouses, but the conversion was never clean. Beneath the hymns, old chants were whispered. Beneath the crucifix, Mjolnir hung. Even after baptism, Sailors carved runes onto the stern posts of ships' protection spells, invocations to Njord, the sea god, or to Aegir, the great wave lord who ruled the deep with 9 daughters. It was dangerous not to honor them, because the Western Sea was not just distance, it was threshold. The Norse believed in liminal spaces, crossings where one reality bled into another, the edge of a forest, the crest of a mountain, the meeting point of river and sea, and the Western Ocean was the greatest liminal space of all, the place where the gods walked, unseen, guiding those who dared step beyond the map. Even the sagas acknowledge it obliquely. In Grönlandinga Títur, a sailor is said to go mad, staring too long into the fog where the sky forgets itself. Madness, in Norse myth, often marked divine presence, Odin's gift, or curse, to those who glimpse too much. Could this fog, this sky forgetting itself, be the veil between Midgard and something else? Could the Norse have believed that in sailing west, they weren't just exploring, they were crossing into the mythic unknown? The Christian chroniclers who recorded these stories often edited them. They inserted divine providence, saints, and miracles, where once there had been seeresses and omens, but they could not erase the bones of the belief, because the old gods are hard to bury, especially when they're carved in stone, etched in driftwood, or folded into the cadence of a storm. The Norse did not stop believing because they sailed west. They believed harder, because out there beyond the whale road, past the winds where compasses stuttered and stars turned strange, they needed the gods more than ever. And maybe, just maybe, the gods answered. Part 17. Runes, lost in the New World. They were meant to endure. Runes were never mere letters to the Norse. They were portals, sound and spirit forged into shape, sacred symbols born of the god Odin's sacrifice. In the old myths, he hung from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, wounded, without food or drink, until the runes revealed themselves to him. They were not invented. They were discovered, pulled from the fabric of reality itself. And so, when the Norse carved them into bone, into wood, into stone, they did not write. They invoked, which is why their presence in the New World cannot be treated as coincidence. Scattered across North America are runic inscriptions that defy tidy explanation. Many have been dismissed as hoaxes, others remain unexplained. But each has a voice, quiet, stubborn, half-buried, and together they murmur a possibility, that the Norse not only reached Vinland, but marked it, and that the land still bears their signs. One of the most famous, and most controversial, is the Kensington runestone. Discovered in 1898 beneath the roots of a tree in Minnesota, the slab bears an inscription in medieval runes describing a Norse party of 30 men traveling west from Vinland. It includes a date, 1360. Too late, say many. The Greenland settlements were collapsing by then. The colonies were cut off. The longships no longer sailed. But others argue differently, because 1362 was also the height of a warming phase, a brief reprieve in the Little Ice Age. Sea ice retreated, travel became possible again, and within Greenland itself, fragments of oral memory suggest a last desperate push westward, perhaps not by royal order, but by wanderers, refugees, wayfarers, seeking land before their world froze shut. The Kensington stone may be a hoax, but the language is strange, not a 19th century recreation, but a mix of archaic Swedish and Norse dialects that would have been nearly unknown at the time of its discovery. Some rune forms are extinct. Others resemble those found in Greenlandic artifacts now lost to time. It may not prove the Norse reached Minnesota, but it proves someone remembered the way they wrote. And it's not the only one. In Westford, Massachusetts, a weathered rock bears the faint carving of a Norse sword and shield and what some claim is a runic dedication. In Oklahoma, The Heavener runestone stands in a wooded ravine, its vertical inscription debated fiercely for decades. Is it a simple carving, a misread indigenous mark, or is it an echo? There are runes carved into cliff faces in Ontario, symbols found near coastal Maine, scratchings beneath old chapel stones in Newfoundland. Too many to ignore. Most scholars dismiss these as fabrications or coincidence. But the Norse had a tradition of leaving markstones inscriptions not to boast, but to bind memory to place. In Iceland, one such stone reads, I, Thorvald, passed this way with sorrow in my chest and wind in my back, found half buried near a forgotten trail. It was never meant to be seen, only to remain. The Norse believed that by carving runes, they could fix a moment, preserve a truth. And when a people vanish, when their maps are burned, their scrolls destroyed, what remains are the marks they made in stone. But what if they were smarter than we think? In recent years, archaeologists have begun re-examining sites once classified as indigenous or colonial and discovering hidden layers, runes etched faintly beneath later carvings, Norse graffiti sealed beneath chapel walls, fire-blackened stones that, when cleaned and studied, bear trace markings in the Elder Futhark, the oldest runic alphabet. And then there are the artifacts. A bone comb, found near Lance O Meadows, bears shallow lines once thought decorative. Under microanalysis, they form a partial bind rune, a magical symbol used to protect travelers. A spindle whorl discovered in Labrador shows intersecting staves matching Norse pattern chants. Even a wooden post, long decayed, left behind an iron nail that, when scanned, revealed a spiral grain scar, the imprint of runes carved before the wood was burned. These are not hoaxes. They are residue, and their presence raises the question, how much else lies just beneath the surface? Because runes were never meant for permanence. They were carved into driftwood, into doors, into the bones of animals, objects meant to decay, to return to the earth, carrying their message like seeds. But a few survive, enough to suggest that the Norse in Vinland did not forget who they were, even as they fled Christian persecution, even as they married into new tribes, even as their language faded and their stories warped into legend they carved. Because to carve was to remember, and memory, once written in runes, does not die easily. Some believe the bind runes they used were more than symbols. They were keys, part of a navigational code, linked to the Vegvisir and the night-sung maps described in lost sagas. A rune for wind, a rune for course, a stave for safe return. We may never decipher them fully, but we know this. The Sea Kings marked their path, and the land, the stones, the wood, the bones of the earth still holds those marks, waiting, not for glory, but for recognition. Part 18. The Vinland Codex. Some books are not made to be read. Some are made to be hidden, compiled in secret, copied in darkness, passed hand to hand like smuggled fire. And among the strangest, most disputed, and potentially most explosive of these is the manuscript whispered about in monastic margins and conspiracy circles alike, the Vinland Codex. No single document has stirred more speculation, more skepticism, and more quiet obsession among historians of the Norse westward voyages. Because if it is real, and if it says what some believe it says, then it changes everything. The earliest mention of the Codex comes not from Scandinavia but from southern France. In 1473, a monk at the Abbey of Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire noted in his ledger, a volume arrived with the merchants from the north, bound in ice leather, marked in the northern tongue, speaking of lands past Greenland, where wine is found among trees. He called it Liber de Terris Ultra Mare Congelatum, a book of lands beyond the frozen sea. No such manuscript survives in that abbey's collection. But in 1906, A Jesuit scholar named Father Anselmo Moretti uncovered a loose folio in the vaults of a now-vanished Florentine library. The pages were brittle, the script a mix of Old Norse, Latin, and strange runic shorthand. In his personal notes, Moretti referred to the text as Codex Winlandia. The manuscript disappeared again during the chaos of World War II. Some say it was destroyed in the Allied bombing of Rome. Others whisper it was seized by the Vatican and locked in the Archivum Secretum, but pieces of it or copies may still exist. In 1999, a private collector in Reykjavik produced a single folio he claimed was part of the lost codex. The vellum was carbon dated to the early 15th century. The ink contained soot common to Greenlandic hearths. The writing, though faded, included these lines. There, past the tongue of fire and the great Elk River, we found soft land where apples fell in snow and stars did not rest. We marked it with the serpent stone and left gifts of red iron. Linguists have noted that the phrasing matches no known saga but mirrors Greenlandic monastic verse. The tongue of fire may be a reference to the Bay of Fundy's volcanic shores. The Elk River could be the St. John or Miramichi, and the serpent stone, a motif found in Norse graves from Jutland to Reykjavik, was a common boundary marker. In other words, the codex is not legend. It is data, not structured like a saga, but like a logbook, fragments of navigation, trade accounts, weather notations, religious reflection, even medicinal recipes. But woven into its technical detail is a strange spiritual thread. The codex speaks of the way west through the skin of the world, a phrase that some scholars interpret as a shamanic metaphor, possibly describing the spiritual experience of long-distance navigation under altered states, like those induced by seether practitioners. It refers to a circle of 9 fires, possibly a settlement or ceremonial site. It mentions a child born beyond the sun's reach who dreamed of the golden god, perhaps a reference to Leif Erikson's son Snorri, or to a later descendant raised in the New World. But most tantalizing is this line: the map is not on the skin but in the song. Those who remember the chant may find the path again. This echoes oral traditions among Greenlandic Norse and even among some Algonquian tribes that certain routes were sung, not drawn. The codex may be describing a memory technology now lost, musical wayfinding, in which rhythms encoded spatial cues. If true, then the codex contains not only records of where the Norse went, but how they remembered it. Some modern researchers believe the codex could be linked to the Xenomap, a 15th century Venetian chart that shows anomalous islands in the North Atlantic, with features resembling Newfoundland, Labrador, and even parts of New England. The map, long dismissed as a fraud, may in fact be a distorted version of information derived from the codex passed through generations of monastic copyists and cartographers who no longer understood what they held. The last known reference to the Vinland Codex appears in the diary of a German antiquarian named Otto Wolff, who traveled to Iceland in 1937. He wrote of a fireskin book wrapped in whalecloth kept by a hermit near Skagafjörður, who claimed it had been in his family for 12 generations. Wolff vanished in 1942. His diary, however, survived and is now in a private collection in Denmark. No one has confirmed whether the codex he saw was authentic, but legends persist. In certain Icelandic families, stories are still told quietly, without boasting of ancestors who knew the true name of Vinland, who sang the map on winter nights, and who passed down a bundle of pages too sacred to share, pages that tell of lands not found on Christian charts, of rivers that mirror the stars, of ruins that breathe beneath pine and snow. If even a fragment of the Vinland Codex survives in a vault, in a farmhouse, in some forgotten folio mislabeled and shelved in the wrong library, it would be one of the most explosive historical revelations in modern memory, because it would prove that the Norse knew what they had found, that they recorded it, and that someone, perhaps more than one, has been guarding that memory for over 1,000 years. Not for profit, not for power, but for truth. And truth, like the sun over Vinland's quiet horizon, always finds a way to rise. Part 19. The Return of the Wayfinders. They are not dead. They were never dead. The Wayfinders, the sea priests, the chant guides, the star readers may have vanished from the pages of history, but they live in the wind-shaped memory of the North. In ancient songs, in whispered stories passed from grandfather to grandson across centuries of storm and ice, they remain. And now, their footsteps are returning. For 1,000 years we forgot how to listen. We mapped the world in straight lines and coordinates, erased the sea's voice beneath diesel engines and satellite feeds. But there are still those who remember, or who seek to remember the old paths, and they are sailing again. In recent decades, a quiet resurgence has begun. Historians, linguists, adventurers, and descendants of the Norse bloodline are reclaiming what was lost, not through conquest, but through reconnection. They are following the trail left by the Sea Kings, not to prove dominance, but to understand how memory moves when carved in wave and wind. In 2000, a hand-built Norse gnar called the Snorri crossed the North Atlantic using traditional techniques: no engine, no GPS. The crew relied on sunstones, star charts, sea color, and the guidance of Icelandic weather sages. They made landfall in Newfoundland, not by chance, by design, by remembrance. The voyage was not just symbolic, it was archaeological. Every swell tested the theories of how the Vikings sailed. Every turn confirmed the sagas. They did not wander blindly. They knew. But it is not only ships that are returning. In the forests of Labrador and the coasts of Nova Scotia, First Nations elders speak of renewed interest in the old stories, the ones that mention strangers from across the sea, who did not conquer, but shared, who taught and listened. The stories are changing, growing clearer. Some have even been matched to Norse accounts once thought apocryphal. The timelines match. The paths match. There is talk of joint efforts between indigenous historians and Nordic scholars to retrace these shared routes, to find not just evidence, but kinship. Because if the Norse stayed, even briefly, even as guests or exiles, then their story is not one of invasion. It is one of entanglement, of becoming. And this may be the greatest secret the Wayfinders left behind, that they were not just navigators of the sea, they were navigators of culture. They carried with them not only iron and tales, but the capacity to merge, to shift, to disappear into the land, and live on through others. Somewhere in New England, in a wooded valley untouched by modern development, a researcher walks a deer trail carrying a hand-copied version of a Norse chant, translated phonetically from a saga fragment. She sings it under her breath. The birds hush, the wind leans, and for a moment, the trees feel older than they should. In western Iceland, an old man speaks to a film crew of his grandmother, who swore that her mother once spoke a lullaby with words, not Icelandic, not Danish. When sung to a Greenlandic elder, the melody matches a funeral chant for travelers lost at sea. In digital forums, modern rune masters, scholars of both linguistics and esoterica, compare bind runes found on unearthed artifacts to new patterns found in LIDAR scans of New World sites. The shapes align. The curves echo. Some believe it is coincidence. Others do not. And beneath the glacier in Greenland, teams prepare. The ice is thinning. The ancient site, codenamed Vidaheimer, draws nearer to the moment of revelation. The structure beneath is no longer theory. It is fact. The only question is what it will reveal, and what else may lie near it. A cache of staves, a scroll sealed in amber, a map burned into whalebone and hidden in frost. Somewhere, perhaps, a child waits, a descendant whose ancestors forgot to forget. Who carries in blood what others seek in books? Who dreams of starlit sea crossings without knowing why? And the sea waits too. The Atlantic, that cold cathedral of memory, does not give up its stories easily, but neither does it bury them forever. For the wayfinders, those who sang maps and read the flight of gulls like scripture, were too careful, too reverent to let all be lost. They did not fear forgetting. They planned for it. Their songs were made to last beyond voice. Their staves were carved deep. Their wisdom, like the Vegvisir, was built not to point north, but to guide through storm. And the storm is lifting. A new generation of scholars, storytellers, and seekers has begun to read the sky again, not for conquest, not for discovery, but for return. They do not carry swords. They carry stories. They are not kings. They are rememberers. And they sail not forward, but home. Part 20. What the maps still hide. We thought the maps were flat. We thought they were tools, instruments of direction, lines upon vellum, pointing to new lands to conquer, seas to name, coastlines to claim. But the Norse maps, the true ones, were not drawn to show territory. They were drawn to show truth. And truth, to the sea kings, was never just physical. What the maps still hide is not a lost continent or a buried city, but something deeper, a way of seeing the world that we have forgotten, a worldview where landscape is not passive but alive, where memory is carved into rock and sung into wind, where space and story cannot be separated, because one is the other. We have walked past these maps for centuries. We called them cairns, runes, myths. We found carved stones and named them decorative. We dismissed oral histories as invention. We silenced songs that spoke of raven-guided ships and fruit-bearing shores beyond the ice. But the maps never left. They waited. They waited beneath the glaciers of Greenland, where the walls of a forgotten hall still hum with the last breath of those who saw Vinland with their own eyes. They waited in the root-dense soil of Newfoundland, where a Norse spindle whorl still holds the curve of a woman's hand. They waited in the DNA of an Icelandic child, who dreams of forests she's never seen, in the place names that echo old staves, in the stars that still rise on the same rhythm sung by seafarers 1,000 years ago. What the maps hide is this, that the Norse wayfinders did not just discover new lands. They wove them into memory. They were not chroniclers of empire. They were custodians of meaning. Each landfall, each chant, each carved stave was a thread in a greater tapestry, one not meant to rule, but to endure. A cartography of the soul, stitched into the sea. And because we stopped listening, we thought it was lost. But it was never lost. It was buried, intentionally, carefully, in story, in stone, in silence. Because the Norse knew what would come. They saw the rise of a colder faith, a hungrier world, a world that would burn their songs, rewrite their sagas, and reduce their gods to footnotes. So they hid the old ways. They cloaked them in parable. They let their charts become legends. And in doing so, they preserved something more powerful than territory. They preserved truth beneath forgetting. Today, the official maps still omit them. The textbooks still gloss over their voyages. The archaeologists still debate the runes. But in the dark corners of libraries, in the flicker of firelight in longhouses rebuilt by hand, in the chant of wind, through fjord and forest, the old maps stir. They are waking, and they do not point to gold or glory. They point to remembrance. They show us how to navigate not just oceans, but time, how to see through the fog of centuries, how to trace the contour of lost knowledge in the rhythm of wave and wood. And most of all, they remind us of a simple, terrible, beautiful truth, that what is forgotten is not gone. It is waiting, waiting in bone and ash, in song and soil, in blood. The Sea Kings did not leave us a flag. They left us a map, and now at last we are beginning to follow it home.